Conversations with Grandfather, Volume 1, Decoding Grandfather's First Prophecy. The reason that I'm doing this in this way and not just sitting down by myself in a room is that I need an audience. Okay, basically I need a group of people because I feed off the energy of the people, you know, from that whole consciousness of the group or keeper of the group or whatever. If you're not reading something, it's, you know, you read something, it's easy to do in a recording studio. But when you're taking stuff off the top of your head, which this will be, you know, I need that kind of reaction. Now, basically what this is call it the first in a series of recordings that I'm going to put out. And the series is important to me for a number of reasons. They are stories, mythology, stuff like that about me and Grandfather, about Grandfather and his travels, stories that he collected over that period of time, and various other parables and stuff that I want to preserve. The subject that I'm going to go into today, I think, and I've really searched my soul about this, many of you have heard before, in that it is me spelling out Grandfather's prophecies. I think that that is the best way to start this whole series, with that. However, unlike other classes, such as you heard me mention it in the Sweat Lodge class, and the prophecy class, I'm actually going to expound on it more. In fact, if you go back and check your notes to those classes, you're going to find that, whoa, he went way out with this particular thing. Now, I've been wrestling with what to call this particular recording. And, you know, all kinds of things come to mind, from, you know, Grandfather's prophecies to, you know, the world of man, you know, whatever. And the one that comes to mind the most is decoding Grandfather's prophecies. Now, why I say that is we heard of the major best-selling book, The Da Vinci Codes. And there's other programs on TV, Decoding the Past or whatever. Now, the funny thing is that term, decoding Grandfather's prophecies, makes me laugh, because there's basically nothing to decode. It is all there if you know how to read those prophecies as I wrote them, and if you know the man Grandfather and what makes him tick. You know, in the past, you get people like Nostradamus and people like that who used to write their predictions in code, mainly because they were afraid of the church, the bishops and everybody else getting a hold of this and saying, okay, this is blasphemy, and, you know, end up getting burned at the stake or something. That is one way that prophets would write their prophecies, is in a code. The other way is they would write them or talk about them as they were given that vision or that insight into the future. Now, the problem with that is visions and dreams are highly personal, as you know. If I ask the 14 of you in this room to picture a coyote running across a moonlit sky, what does that conjure in your mind? What emotion does that evoke? What does that mean to you? I'd come up with 14 different meanings, because each of you have a different representation, a different symbology of the coyote running, the moon, and all the other things that go with it. So there lies the problem, is when somebody tries to give you a vision that they had, in that context of their vision, it was given to them in a very highly personal way. It is not your symbology. It does not evoke the same emotion. And the only way to get through that is to know the individual intimately and personally that delivered that prophecy. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do now, is to give you insights into Grandfather and how he would present anything, not just prophecy, but anything that he taught. You know, Grandfather dealt in an economy of words. He was like the master of one-liners. The master of one-liners. And in one simple line, there could be volumes of meaning. I remember Rick and I were sitting at camp, where the primitive camp sits today. And Grandfather walked up to us and said, "I am going toward the stream," meaning the swim area. And he walked away. But the funny thing is, as we watched him walk away, he did not head down the path to the swim area. Instead, not 30 feet beyond, he took a right turn. And then we could see him a half hour later way the hell over the other side of the trail. And we started to realize that Grandfather did not say, "I'm going to the stream. I'm going toward it." And that took us a while in our young minds to fathom. What Grandfather was doing is he was purposely not writing anything in stone. He was cutting himself the latitude to explore, to have adventure, to not follow a linear type of direction. Instead, it gave him the latitude to move as he wanted. God knows how long it took him to get down to the stream, because he carefully worded things in one line. I'm going toward the stream. I'm going toward the swim area. Not to. In fact, I rarely ever heard him use the word going to. In fact, even when he dealt with patients that were critical and he had to get there, he would never say, "I'm going to Jake's house or Old Man Torrance's house." I am going toward. And I knew what that meant after a while. Toward gave him the latitude to collect the plants, minerals, or whatever else he needed to treat Jake or Torrance or whatever. So much was contained in one line. And if you keep that foremost on your mind when you read anything about Grandfather's prophecies, then you realize that in a simple sentence, it could contain volumes of information. I just got done recording in The Quest a chapter called Prophecy, and I made an offhand comment that I could do 20 books on just those simple 8 to 10 paragraphs, whatever that prophecy encompassed. You know, I look back on writing that prophecy chapter and all the volumes of journals that I had collected just dealing with those 4 prophecies of man's destruction. And I thought to myself, now how am I going to distill this down for the general public to read and understand? What becomes harder is the second question. How am I going to write this in true coyote fashion, where it has those layers, those veneers of meaning, so that when my students, my graduates of a standard class or a philosophy class, reread it, it's like reading something fresh and new, something that is hidden. It took me ages to write that chapter, longer than any other chapter I've ever written. But all my books, all my chapters are written in that way. Written, yes, that superficial meaning for the general reading public, but then they're written in those tiers of meaning, that as a person advances through the Tracker School and in through Grandfather's philosophy, they begin to detect and understand a hidden meaning. In fact, I don't think there's a line any place that you can't pick apart for hidden meaning, and that's a very long and arduous way of writing. And sometimes it doesn't fit into the modern literary scheme of things. But I'm not writing it for modern literary geniuses. I'm writing it as Grandfather set it forth. And a lot of what I put in the prophecy was from a grandfather's exact words. And as I read through it, you'll find me stopping line after line after line to expand on the meaning, because a lot of people are left scratching their head. Well, what does he mean by this? Well, if they just take time and look at those few words or that one sentence, they'd realize what Grandfather was trying to say. And once you understand how my books are written and understand the man Grandfather and his ability with words to evoke meaning, passion, inspiration, then you can decipher everything that he went through, that he told us, he passed on to us. There's no code that has to be deciphered. All there is time. Time to sit down and think about what he's saying. What is he actually meaning? And if you look at something that he said and you say to yourself, now what does he mean by that? And start looking at those words, that sentence, whatever else, with that kind of eye, then the true meaning reveals itself. And the funny thing is, it's a domino effect. Once that meaning, that new meaning, makes itself manifest, then it opens up another meaning and another and another. It's like the old story of Go Ask the Mice. When can I stop learning from Go Ask the Mice? Because as soon as I figure I've got it mastered, my God, something I never even considered crops up. And all of his words, everything he did, keeps inspiring me day after day. In fact, I'll remember something he said when I was 7, 8 years old, that all of a sudden I'll be in the midst of doing something mundane and those words will come hammering back as if out of left field. Words I never even considered before, all of a sudden has relevance right now. Big relevance, enlightenment, epiphanies. So, we go into the book. Two things I want to cover before I get into prophecy. The second part of it is going to be one I want to include. But the concept of one-liners that Grandfather had come out with is two of them come to mind, dealing with his economy of words and how just the words can evoke such deep meaning and thought. I remember this one time that Rick and I were at camp, and we were working on some project. It was a dual project. I can't even remember what it was, but I remember it was the spring, and I look over, and here's Grandfather sitting on a little deer run, and he's staring at the bud of a blueberry. And I knew what he was going to do. He was going to sit there, if it took all day, to watch that flower open. That's the way he was. Time in Grandfather's world did not exist. I mean, he would be spellbound for hours, sometimes days, watching something like a flower open. He'd never be bored. He'd never eat. He'd never drink any water. He was totally consumed by it. And I knew what he was doing, so Rick and I were a little antsy that, he wasn't teaching anything. When he got into one of these modes or moods, he would zone us out real quick. I think it was self-preservation sometimes. But anyway, I walked over to him, and I said to him, "Hey, Grandfather, how's it going?" figuring I could distract him. Now, he didn't move. His eyes were glued to that bud. And he said, all I am is now. And that's one line so stunned me because I knew it spoke volumes. It was like one of those things, oh no, here we go again. Here is research now, forever. But all I am is now. No past, no future, just right now. And when you think about that in the context of a child, you think all there is in a child's mind is the joy of play and the total dedication to the moment. You think that is what grandfather was in that moment, a child. A child. And that's the kind of thing that would evoke that kind of deep, endless thought that would go on months, in some cases years. I remember another instance that grandfather and Rick and I were talking about how crazy people can get with philosophical, time-wasting questions. For instance, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one around to hear it, can it make a sound? Or does it make a sound, kind of a thing? Or is God so powerful that he could make a rock so big that he could not lift? And to me, to grandfather, that is a blatant waste of spiritual time to try to contemplate something that absurd, that stupid. All you're doing is taking yourself out of spiritual time and sidetracking yourself. And I remember the conversation the night before. It got into these hypothetical spiritual questions, and we laughed about it and stuff like that. And I was passing grandfather, and grandfather was doing something. I can't remember what it was. I think he was making an arrowhead. And I jokingly said to him, so, grandfather, what is the meaning of life? Figuring I'd be smug and. And he looked at me quite seriously and he said to me, grandson, I can only answer that question when your life has meaning. And there was another brick that I was hit by, And it just that kind of one-line thing just can carry you for the rest of your life. I chose as this first in a series, call them preservation stories or whatever, to do the prophecy, to decode grandfather's prophecy, not that it needs decoding. And my biggest fear is this getting into the hands of the general public, people who don't know me, don't know grandfather, never read any of my books, and they immediately imagine some fool standing on the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway of New York with a big cardboard sign that says, the end is coming. Well, of course the end is coming, but everybody looks at them like they're, weird, so to speak. But anyway, and it's ironic that just a couple of weeks ago, a major television show had called me and said, we'd like you to come on and be a guest on the show. So anyway, we asked, okay, what's the subject? And they said, the end of the world. What do we do, kind of a thing. And of course, my answer to them was, no, thank you. Because even if I got on that show, people are not going to understand. The problem is, though, today we are faced with a very, very dire situation. I mean, if people think that we can keep living our lives the way that we're living it right now, they got their head in the sand. We got new diseases that are emerging. We've got global warming. We haven't closed up the hole in the sky. We're running out of fossil fuels. In the meantime, putting out greenhouse gases at an alarming rate. It is just looking at what we have done, and anybody that has the stupidity to think that we can continue needs to have their head examined. Even people who think, okay, we can rectify the situation, we can possibly reverse it. That's also absurd, because it ain't going to happen in our lifetime. It ain't going to happen in our lifetime. It's going to take a number of generations for that to happen, if and when this can ever be reversed. Anyway, with that in mind, the fear of people looking at this and saying, wow, he's nuts. Look again. These prophecies were given to me in 1962. I was 12 years old. Nothing that I'm going to read to you had yet come to pass. In fact, half of what is written in those prophecies when I wrote this book, The Quest, and the chapter, The Prophecies, had not occurred yet. Had not occurred. Anyway, let's get to it. Grandfather used to set Rick and I up. When he wanted to teach us something, he never let us know that he wanted to teach it. For instance, I remember the first time he ever taught me a bow drill. We had no matches, and it was cold. It was cold. And he reaches into his little bag, pulls out a bow drill, and fires up a coal into a tinder bundle. With one hand, he's holding that tinder bundle with that smoking coal. The other one, he grabbed a tiny little bow, spindle, fireboard, handhold, and stuck it back in his bag. And we're like, what was that? And he blew it to flames as easily as you would light a match. So we asked him, Grandfather, can you show that to us? No, not yet. You're not old enough. Now you know what that does to two little kids' minds. What do you mean we're not old enough? No, not yet. And he'd keep this going for months. And we'd get hunger for it more and more. We kept badgering him for it. We wanted it so bad. We wanted to learn a bow drill fire making more than we wanted to breathe, you know? Then he'd teach it. In fact, when I look back on not just the major lessons, but the minor lessons, skills, techniques, tracking, awareness that Grandfather taught us, there was always this lead in. There was always something that he shrewdly set up in the way of the coyote. He would bait us, and we never realized we were being baited. That day, or that evening rather, that he gave us the 4 prophecies of man's destruction was no exception. We had virtually been hiking a trail that we had not taken back before. It was a back trail to this hill that we call Prophecy Hill. It was there on this hill in the Pine Barrens that Grandfather delivered all his major prophecies. Anyway, we're on this route that we had never taken before, and we took this side path, this deer trail, through this tangle of brush and greenbriers and stuff. And I realized we were going to a place of an old settlement. There was old sycamore trees there, trees that you would not find in the Pine Barrens normally. So right away, we knew it was a settlement, a forgotten town of the pines, and we came upon an old cemetery. And Grandfather led us right to this particular gravestone. And he pulled back some vines that were covering the gravestone. The name had been obliterated. But what hadn't been obliterated was 12 years old. The same age Rick and I were at that time. And here was this gravestone of a boy our age who had died at 12 years old. And that grandfather began to use as his way of opening up these 4 prophecies of man's destruction. He asked us, who was this boy? What did he do? Was he like the rest of society who just worked for the sake of working? What were his hopes? What were his dreams? What were his visions? Did he try to look for a spiritual life? Or just did he cave into the routine of the flesh? That got us thinking. What did we do? What were we doing? If we died today, what would our legacy be? Some forgotten grave eroded by time, forgotten dreams, forgotten visions, forgotten lives? Were we making a difference? Were we making things happen? That set the stage for the prophecies. You see, I had always thought that I was going to be grandfather's age. You know, my vision from a very young age was to teach what grandfather was teaching me. I didn't want this to be lost. But you see, it was teaching in my own terms. You know, I figured, okay, I'll be 83 years old like grandfather and find 2 young kids that want to learn this real bad, and I'll teach them. Little did I know what was at hand. But grandfather simply said, you know, you got to come out of the woods. You got to live your vision in society. And I was appalled. I was like, no way was I coming out of the woods. Anyway, give me a minute to get to that conversation here. I wasn't going to put this in, but this is grandfather talking. Who are these people? Who is this boy? What did they work for? And what were their hopes, dreams, and visions? Did they just work physically, or did they work for the things beyond the flesh, for a grander purpose? Certainly they affected the spirit that moves in all things, but did they really work to the best of their ability to make things better for the future of their grandchildren? Or did they do nothing other than to perpetuate the myth of society? Were they happy, joyous, and filled with spiritual rapture, or did they just lead lives of labor and mediocrity? And did this young boy live close to the earth and to the Creator? Or did he just give up his youth, his sense of adventure, to toil as did his parents and their parents before them? This boy was exactly your age, and I suspect he had hopes and dreams much like yours. But this is his legacy, laying in a forgotten grave. But, grandfather, I asked, isn't it enough just to be happy and live your life fully? After a long moment of silence, grandfather answered, it is not enough that man be just happy in the flesh, but he must also be happy and joyous in spirit. For without spiritual happiness and rapture, life is shallow. Without seeking the things of the Spirit, life is but half-lived and emptied. And by spiritual life, I do not mean just setting aside 1 hour of 1 day of a 1 week for worship, but to seek the things of the Spirit every moment of every day. I ask you then, what did these people do to seek spiritual enlightenment and rapture? Did they just give into a life that was little more than work? They were given a choice every day of their lives, as you will be given a choice to seek the rapture of the Spirit or to resign yourselves to a life of meaningless work. The end result is always the same: forgotten graves and forgotten dreams of forgotten people. It is not important that anyone notice or remember, but that you work to touch God and affect in a positive way the consciousness of the Spirit that moves in all things, thus bringing the consciousness of man closer to the Creator. He goes on with our journey. Here it is. When Grandfather was explaining that it didn't make any difference if anyone ever remembered us, this is what he was trying to tell us. One person, one idea, one thought can turn the flock of society away from the destructive path of modern times. It is not a question as to whether we make a difference, for we all make a difference, each of us in our own way. It is the difference we make that is important. You see, he didn't care about the boy's hopes, dreams, visions, just that that boy made a difference. So his name was forgotten. So his dreams and visions were forgotten. Just by being alive, he affected the Spirit that moves through all things. But what difference did he make in his life? And then, Grandfather lowered the boom and said that we cannot realize our vision if we run away and hide in the bush. Only when we take our vision out to society will it become reality. Will it affect the Spirit that moves through all things in a positive way? He continues by saying, "It is not enough," Grandfather said, "just to seek the things of the Spirit on a personal level. To do so is selfish. And those who just seek the spiritual realms for themselves are not working to change the Spirit that moves through the consciousness of man. Instead, they are running away, hiding from the responsibility, and using their wisdom for their own glorification. Spiritual man must then work for a principle, a cause, a quest far greater than the glorification of self in order to affect the Spirit that can change the course of man's destruction." What Grandfather was saying is that a spiritual person must take the wisdom and philosophy of the earth and bring it back into modern society. But then Grandfather warned us. Trying to live a spiritual life in modern society is the most difficult path one can walk. It is a path of pain, of isolation, and of shaken faith. But that is the only way that our vision can become reality. It is a path of pain, of isolation, of shaken faith. You know, when Grandfather said that, I had to question it. Why could I not stay in the woods and live a spiritual life? Said to myself, wouldn't that affect the Spirit that moves through all things? Wouldn't that affect in some way the consciousness of man? And I remember Grandfather suddenly, his voice shattering my thoughts. He said, "The earth is dying. The destruction of man is close, so very close, and we must all work to change that path of destruction. We must pay for the sins of our grandfathers and grandmothers, for we have long been a society that kills its grandchildren to feed its children. There can be no rest, and we cannot run away. Far too many have run away in the past. It is very easy to live a spiritual life away from man. But the truth of vision in spiritual life can only be tested and become a reality when lived near society." I then asked Grandfather, How do you know? How do you know that we're close to the end? And Grandfather simply said, I had a vision. Now, when Grandfather said he had a vision, you took notice. You know, I look back over all the prophecies that Grandfather had ever made, major and minor, and to this date, he's never been wrong. I have never read of anyone like that. I've never heard of anyone that good. I've never met anyone that could predict the probable and possible futures with such uncanny accuracy. But just as a side note, remember that Grandfather would be the first to tell you that the future does not exist. Does not exist. Instead, there are only possible and probable futures. It's like the palm of the hand. The palm of our hand is our now. And the choices that we make now, the things that we do now, determine which possible future we will take, both on a personal and global level. So each finger on that hand represents a possible future. But there's always one that is the strongest, that seems to be sucking the life out of the now. And that is the probable future. And that is what Grandfather so accurately predicted. Along with that thought, and this is still quoting Grandfather, thus the true quest in life is to live the philosophy of the earth within the confines of man. There is no church or temple for us where we need to seek peace, for ours are the temples of the wilderness. There are no spiritual leaders, for our hearts and the Creator are our only leaders. Our numbers are scattered. Few speak our language or understand the things that we live. Thus we walk this path alone, for each vision, each quest is unique unto the individual. But we must walk within society, or our vision dies. For a man not living his vision is living death. When Grandfather said that, that was absolute. That was simply, if you don't bring your vision to society, if you don't work to try to change the probable future, then you're dead. You might as well not be living at all. Now, what I'm going to do now is start into Grandfather's prophecies. And I'm going to read through a paragraph, just as it's written. Then I'm going to come back to it and pull it apart. Grandfather had been wandering for several years and was well into his 40s when the vision of the 4 signs were given to him. He had just finished his 3rd vision quest at the Eternal Cave when the vision made itself known. He had been seated at the mouth of the cave, awaiting the rising sun, when the spirit of the warrior appeared to him. He felt as if he were in a state somewhere between dream and reality, sleep and wakefulness, until the spirit finally spoke and he knew that it was not his imagination. The spirit called Grandfather's name and beckoned him to follow. As Grandfather stood, he was suddenly transported to another world. Again he thought that he was dreaming, but his flesh could feel the reality of this place. His senses knew that this was a state of abject reality, but in another time and place. Just on that, one paragraph, I could probably write a book easily. There's so many hidden meanings, and I come from a place where I know Grandfather. I mean, I lived with the man virtually for nearly 11 years. I knew his idiosyncrasies. I knew the way he thought. I knew his symbology. I adopted his symbology, his mythology. And just the contents. And then you got to remember that once he delivered these prophecies, it would unfold week after week after week. He'd take us back to a particular point. And for the better part of a week, 2 or 3 or more, he would talk about that one single point. Now, just in the first sentence, Grandfather had been wandering for several years. Now, where was he wandering? What was he doing? Well, that goes back to the Grandfather book. He was all over North and South America. He was learning as much as he could possibly learn. Grandfather had been wandering for several years and was well into his 40s when the vision of the 4 signs were given to him. He was in his 40s. 40s. That's a lot of years. He left his people to wander when he was 21. He had a lot of miles under his belt. And you know his 2 visions in life: to preserve as many of the ancient skills as he could possibly find, master them, and then pass them down so they would not be lost to the future. You know what mastery means. Like I ask repeatedly, I can ask someone in my first standard class, have you mastered everything taught in that class yet? And the answer will be the same, no. And that was 30 years ago. 30 years. I say visions of the 4 signs were given to him. When I say sign, when he said sign, he also meant warnings. These were more warnings to people, to humankind. The next sentence, he had just finished his 3rd vision quest at the eternal cave when the vision made itself known. Grandfather had just finished the 3rd vision quest. In his mind, that vision was complete. Thus, subsequently, this vision of the 4 signs, the 4 warnings, took him by surprise. He was ready to leave. He did not know that there was more to come. He was seated at the mouth of the eternal cave, awaiting the rising sun, when the spirit of the warrior appeared to him. Now, it's interesting that the eternal cave is a place where one seeks visions of the future, the probable and possible futures. And I always use the term visionary. When I use the term visionary, that is a vision of probable and possible futures. It is unlike a vision, capital V, where the Creator commands you to do something with your life. It is unlike an uncapitalized vision, which is a waking dream. This visionary context is meant for the probable and possible futures. And usually, at least Rick and I thought, this happened when someone ventured inside the cave. Interesting that Modern research has shown that many caves that were used by shaman and religious leaders and visionaries of the past produce in anyone the same consciousness upon entry into that cave. In other words, in biological terms, a person would slip from beta to alpha state of consciousness, from physical mind to spiritual mind, in grandfather's words. The interesting thing, he was awaiting the rising sun. Now, this is important. This was his third vision quest, and he was awaiting the rising sun. Now, you look at that concept of fours. Fours are a redundancy in grandfather's teachings, as is sevens, like in the 7 arrows. Fours, you have the 4 basic teaching directions: the north, the east, the south, the west. When you look at the north, that is the grandfather of winter. Locked in its frozen, snowy soils is the seeds of a spring yet to be born. The north are the moons of purification, of renewal. Interestingly, the east is the place of the rising sun, which drives away the ignorance of darkness. So too, it is the place of the winged that teaches us to fly high above ourselves and see how insignificant our personal problems are compared to that of the world. It tends to put things in focus. It's no accident that grandfather sat there awaiting the rising sun. What sun was he awaiting? It was the sunrise after the purification, the power of the north. But what kind of purification is it going to be? Is it going to be a society that has succumbed to disease, starvation, poisoning, awaiting a new society to rise from those horrible ashes? Or is he awaiting a society that realized that they made a mistake, that we have been chasing the wrong gods, and somewhere in that winter, in that purging, in that purification, we have made a change without the death, the starvation, the destruction. So grandfather awaited that. Interestingly enough, it was his third vision quest at the eternal cave. Grandfather had hundreds of vision quests up to this point, but it was his third there. You start at the north. He had a vision quest there for the north. He had a vision quest there for the east. He had a vision quest there for the south. He just finished it. So what did he face? The sunset of the west, the darkness to come. What darkness is it going to be? It's the darkness of the world purging itself, the earth purging itself from the cancers of man's thoughts and deeds. To finish that sentence, when the spirit of the warrior appeared to him. You look in my book, Grandfather, or any other book where I mentioned grandfather and his visions, any time a big vision was delivered to grandfather, it was through that warrior spirit. It was through that spirit. Now, this is an important statement. He felt as if he were in a state somewhere between dream and reality, sleep and wakefulness, until the Spirit finally spoke, and he knew it wasn't his imagination. That state that I refer to, that grandfather refers to, is the state of consciousness of the visionary. When you are in that state, you look at things differently. You exist differently. And it is only in that state that one can properly identify and understand the visions of another pertaining to the probable and possible futures. My advice to my veteran students is to get into that state and then read grandfather's prophecies. It's a different way of looking at things. It's like somebody takes off the blindfold and suddenly you're awakened. He said, between dream and reality, sleep and wakefulness. And then he uses that a word, he knew it wasn't his imagination. The Spirit called grandfather's name and beckoned him to follow. When he called grandfather's name, you knew there was an intimacy there. For people reading this for the first time, that Spirit knew grandfather. They had history together. They had visions together. And as I said, that Spirit would appear oftentimes to grandfather when a major vision was delivered. Beckoned him to follow. Grandfather was seated at the mouth of the cave. Beyond that mouth is a sheer drop-off. There is just that lip, big enough maybe for 3 or 4 people to sit on if they're careful. Beckoned him to follow. It depicts a journey. A long journey. A journey through time. A journey of distance. As grandfather stood, he was suddenly transported to another world. Again, he thought that he was dreaming, but his flesh could feel the reality of this place. That's important. He could feel it. He could smell it. He could taste it. He could see it. He could hear it. His senses knew that this was a state of abject reality, but in another time and place. You see, he's moved beyond the classic visionary state. The classic state is where a person is seated in like a movie theater, watching things unfold on that screen. They're separated from it. They are not part of what is going on in that screen. They can see it. They can hear it. But it's two-dimensional. What grandfather did was stepped into that screen in that theater. He became part of it. He was there. His senses were alive. But yet he instinctively, intuitively knew that this was another time and place. This is that state that dimension that we all strive to get to as spiritual people. Where that spiritual world, that visionary world, that world of vision becomes so real that, next paragraph. The spirit warrior spoke to grandfather, saying, "These are the things yet to come that will mark the destruction of man. These things you may never see, but you must work to stop them and pass these warnings on to your grandchildren. They are the probable futures of what will come if man does not come back to the earth and begin to obey the laws of creation and the Creator. There are 4 signs, 4 warnings that only the children of the earth will understand. Each warning marks the beginning of a probable future. And as each warning becomes a reality, so too does the future it marks." With that, the spirit warrior was gone, and grandfather was left alone in this strange new world. There is so much that is contained there, so much power. Skipping down to the second sentence. These things you may never see. You may never see. You see, the Spirit did not say to grandfather, "You will never see them." That's too absolute. That means there is no possible or probable future. There is no hope. You may never see. It's always open-ended. It's what we do with our nows. But there's still that chance that grandfather could have seen these things. A very good chance. But you must work to stop them and pass these warnings on to your grandchildren. Going back to the difference that each of us make, affecting the Spirit that moves through all things. Who was grandfather's grandchildren? Started out with Rick and I. And now it's all of you. And so many countless others that have come under the wing of grandfather's teachings. Which begs the question, what have you done? What have you done to prevent the probable, the inevitable? They are the probable future of what will come if man does not come back to the earth and begin to obey the laws of creation and the Creator. What are the laws grandfather is talking about? What is this coming back to the earth? It's a consciousness. It's a mental attitude. It's a lie that modern people worship. That somehow we're above and beyond the laws of creation. They don't pertain to us. We are insulated. We are isolated. We're exalted. Nature is put there for our use and our abuse, to rape, pillage, and plunder at will. The only thing in modern people's lives is greed and convenience. Grandfather was right. We're a society of people that kill our grandchildren to feed our children. We're doing things that are destroying our grandchildren. The laws, carrying capacity for one. When a deer population gets overpopulated and there's not enough food, There's two factors that intervene: disease and starvation. We're given wake-up calls in our arrogance. We're hit by a blizzard that cuts out half the Northeast. People are brought to their knees. No heat, no electricity, no water. Hurricanes, landslides, wildfires. Yet, as soon as we pick up the pieces and rebuild, we get back to living that lie that we're somehow above and beyond those rules. That's the laws of the creation and the Creator that Grandfather and the Spirit were talking about. There are 4 signs, 4 warnings that only the children of the earth will understand. Why will only the children of the earth understand them? Because we have an intimate connection to the earth. When that plow is dropped into the earth, we can feel it slicing our chests. When that garbage, that oil, that filth is dumped onto the earth, we feel filthy also. Because our connection is real, strong. We hear a different drummer. We live in a different consciousness. We can hear the cries of the burning grasses and the wails of our grandchildren yet to be born. That's why only the children of the earth will understand. All the rest are too arrogant, their heads thrust too deep into the sand. Each warning marks the beginning of a probable future. And as each warning becomes reality, so too does the future it marks. With that, the spirit warrior was gone, and Grandfather was left alone in this strange new world. That got me thinking. Strange new world. Grandfather had wandered all over North and South Americas, from the deepest of jungles to the hottest of deserts. Strange new world. It didn't make sense until the next paragraph. The world he was in was like nothing he had ever known. It was a dry place with little vegetation. In the distance he saw a village. Yet it was made out of tents and cloth rather than from the materials of the earth. As he drew closer to the village, the sense of death overwhelmed him, and he grew sick. He could hear children crying, the moaning of elders, and the sounds of sickness and despair. Piles of bodies lay in the open pits awaiting burial, their contorted faces and frail bodies foretelling of death from starvation. The bodies appeared more like skeletons than flesh. And the children, adults, and elders all looked the same, their once dark brown complexions now ashen gray. Interesting. The world he was in was like nothing he had ever known. It was a dry place with little vegetation. In the distance he saw a village, yet it was made out of tents and cloth rather from the materials of the earth. That says it all. These people were living in tents and cloth villages. Where just a couple of generations in the past, they were living in shelters made from the earth. What that tells you is they lost their skills for survival. They lost their skills. They couldn't survive anymore. During tracking cases, I've had the privilege of being able to travel to places most people will never see in their lifetimes. Africa, the outback of Australia, South America, Central America. And I encounter people who live close to the earth, but even there, I see that the encroachment of civilization has taken its toll. I remember being in a Maasai village, their huts still built of dung, mud, and thatch, still possessed many of the skills that the ancestors possessed herding their precious cattle. But near the fire inside those huts was a box of Strike Anywhere matches. You should have seen the delight on children's faces when I broke out a hand drill and fired up fire in a primitive way. Their way of making fire 100 years ago. But they lost it. That's why grandfather referred to as that village made of tents and cloth. But backing up, the world he was in was like nothing he had ever known. It was a dry place with little vegetation. Now, grandfather grew up in a dry place with little vegetation. Where he grew up, in those hot, arid deserts of north-central Mexico, is some of the hottest and driest around. So what did he mean? It was a world like nothing he had ever known. Here's where the intimacy of knowing grandfather comes in. He came from a tribe, a clan of very loving people. Anybody older than him was a brother and sister. Anybody older still was a mother or father. Anybody older still was his grandmother or grandfather. Anybody younger was little brother, little sister. There was a sense of family, of cohesiveness, of being a clan, a people, a nation. This is the world he was referring to. These people had no sense of family left. No sense of tribe or clan. This is why it was a world like nothing grandfather had ever known. Because in grandfather's world, there was that family, that world of spirit, of passion, of vision, of hope, of purpose, of love, peace, and joy. And these people had none of it. None of it. As he drew closer to the village, the stench of death overwhelmed him, and he grew sick. Would you think for 1 minute that grandfather was sickened by the stench of death? A man who at 2 years old had witnessed the butchering of his mother and father and grandfather and grandmother and had to lay trying to suckle his mother's breast for 5 days before great-grandfather Coyote Thunder could find him? Stench of death? Oh, he lived it. He had encountered so many indigenous people in the Americas, both north and south, slaughtered for their land. He had walked battlegrounds that were weeks old that stenched of death. So that begs the question. He grew sick. Wasn't from the stench of death. He'd seen it before. He'd lived it before. Remember going back, but his flesh could feel the reality of this place. His senses knew that this was a state of abject reality. Grandfather grew sick because disease. He was there. He became diseased, not sickened from the death and the stench, but from the disease. And that is an important note. That disease is a thread that runs through the tapestry of all four prophecies. That disease is the centerpiece. That disease is the kingpin. He could hear children crying, the moaning of elders, and the sounds of sickness and despair. Sickness. Piles of body lay in open pits awaiting burial. Their contorted faces and frail bodies foretelling the death from starvation. The bodies appeared more like skeletons than flesh. And children, adults, and elders all looked the same. Their once dark-bound complexions now ashen gray. I've pulled African Americans out of the woods dead. Dead. In cases of fugitives or lost people. And they never looked ashen gray. Ashen gray comes from starvation and disease. But the gray is a metaphor. Our lives, our paths in life are not etched in stone, according to Grandfather. We don't have a destiny. The Creator doesn't give us a plan. The Creator gives us a choice. If we didn't have choice, everything would be perfect in this world. There'd be no starvation, no disease, no wars, no genocide. But we have a choice. A big choice. Our choices, both as an individual and as a population, mark the probable and possible futures. What are the choices? Just three, according to Grandfather. We can follow the light, seeking spiritual things, trying to change things, heal the earth, heal one another, leading lives of compassion and love. Or we can follow the darkness, a place of greed, convenience, war, genocide. Or, like most people do nothing and become rank and file member of the mindless gray masses who neither follow the light or follow the darkness. Just gray. Gray corpses. You see what I mean? That this could easily, I'm not even scraping the surface. I keep remembering stories and things Grandfather kept adding to it. And the toughest thing was to put my words intermingled with Grandfather's, the master of one-liners. You know, that classic example of it was a land like he never knew. You know, nothing like he ever knew. I mean, that right there, you know, holy crap. Grandfather, you've been to the deserts, or you've seen piles of body rotting in the sun out in, you know, Arizona or whatever. But all of that, you realize what he's saying there. That land, he was not referring to the classic, the earth, the desert, the scant vegetation. It was a land of people where they lost their heritage, where they lost their primitive skill. And that brings, you know, the whole idea that we feel we can rise above the laws of creation. And here's one of these warnings. when this warning came, I said to myself, oh my God, it's happening now, And people are going to take notice. Maybe there's going to be hope, Yeah, right. We never trace it back to ourselves. Never trace it back to ourselves. It's like you'll all remember the time the dolphins were washing up on the beaches along here. I mean, you couldn't walk down the end of the island here and not find a dolphin at least once a week. And that went down to South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, all the way up to Maine. Dolphins. And everybody's saying, whoa, they're getting this disease, very much like AIDS, okay? They're getting a common cold or a common pneumonia or a common cut that their immune systems could normally deal with, and they can't deal with them anymore, and it's killing them. So we poured millions of dollars into dolphin death research. And what they came up with is the dolphins in their migration were going down into the Gulf of Mexico. And they were eating fish that had been tainted by massive outbreaks of red tides. End of report. Nature is at fault. The red tides. The tainted fish, the dolphin eating the tainted fish, weakening the immune system where they succumb to all the manner of illnesses that they normally would have been able to beat. Very similar to AIDS. We missed the link. How come we're getting these massive blooms of red tides? Because of the crap, the pesticides, the fertilizers we are dumping into the Gulf of Mexico at an alarming rate. When Lake Okeechobee starts to release water, outbreaks of red tide prevail, closing off Captiva Island and Sanibel and places like this where massive amounts of fish just wash up. We're to blame for the death of the dolphins, just like we are to blame for that mass starvation in Africa that grandfather bore witness to. As grandfather entered the village, the horror of living starvation struck him deeper. Children could barely walk, elders lay dying, and everywhere were the cries of pain and fear. The stench of death and the sense of hopelessness overwhelmed grandfather, threatening to drive him from the village. It was then that an elder appeared to grandfather, at first speaking in a language that he could not understand. Grandfather realized as the elder spoke that he was the spirit of a man no longer of flesh, but a man that had once walked a spiritual path, possibly a shaman of the tribe. It was then that he understood what the old one was trying to tell him. Back to the key elements of this paragraph. The key sentence here, granted, there's so much that is contained in this village of starvation and everything else. This is the scene. This is a prelude to what we will witness in the fourth prophecy. When this starvation moves from Africa and hits globally. This is what will become commonplace. But the key sentence here, the stench of death and the sense of hopelessness overwhelmed grandfather, threatening to drive him from the village. It wasn't the stench of death. It was the hopelessness. That hopelessness is a disease, a crippling, killing disease. And these people no longer had hope. There was nothing for them. They had lost their primitive skills, their sense of family, of community. And now, there was no hope. That's what was going to drive grandfather from the village. He couldn't take the face of that disease of hopelessness. I used to wonder when I was very young, grandfather talk about diseases, and he'd quite freely throw in the disease of hopelessness, the disease of helplessness, the killing disease of apathy, and so many others. He treated like a disease. Interesting that he runs in to this spirit of a man that once lived. That's a setup for something very crucial in the next paragraph. He assumed it to be, this spirit, a shaman. That's why grandfather could understand the language. At first he didn't understand the language, but then something happened. In spirit, especially in highly spiritual individuals that are walking the same path of enlightenment, there is but a common tongue, a common vision. In the next paragraph, it gets interesting. The elder spoke softly, saying, "Welcome to what will be called the land of starvation. The world will one day look upon all of this with horror and will blame the famine on the weather and the earth. This will be the first warning to the world that man cannot live beyond the laws of creation, nor can it fight nature. If the world sees that it is to blame for this famine, this senseless starvation, then a great lesson will be learned. But I'm afraid that the world will not blame itself, but that the blame will be placed on nature. The world will not see that it created this place of death by forcing these people to have larger families. When the natural laws of the land were broken, the people starved, as nature starves the deer in winter when their numbers are too many for the land to bear." Next paragraph. The old one continued, "These people should have been left alone. They once understood how to live with the earth, and their wealth was measured in happiness, love, and peace. But all of that was taken from them when the world saw theirs as a primitive society. It was then that the world showed them how to farm and live in a less primitive way. It was the world that forced them to live outside the laws of creation, and as a result is now forcing them to die." The old man slowly began to walk away, back to the death and the despair. He turned one last time to grandfather and said, "This will be the first sign. There will come starvation before and after this starvation. But none will capture the attention of the world with such impact as does this one. The children of the earth will know the lessons that are held in all of this pain and death, but the world will only see it as drought and famine, blaming nature instead of itself." With that, the old one disappeared, and grandfather found himself back at the mouth of the eternal cave. Interesting. The elder spoke softly. He was covering anger. He was covering anger. You remember the Spirit came to grandfather and said, "You may never see." Not, "You will see," or "You won't see." You may never see. That's the open end. This shaman didn't say that. Didn't say it. Instead, "But I am afraid that the world will not blame itself, but blame will be placed on nature. The world will not see that it created this place of death by forcing these people to have larger families. He is so angry, he's giving no hope. He's saying to grandfather, the world will not see it. Then, the detachment. The second paragraph, the old one continued, these people should have been left alone. These people? As if he has abandoned them. They're no longer his people. He has disowned them. He didn't say, my people should have been left alone. No, these people should have been left alone. One of the things, and this is going back years of my travels, every time I have visited an indigenous group of people still clinging to their skills, I hear the same lament from the elders. We're losing our young people. Our young people are allured by the towns and the cities. They think by leaving this, they can live a better life. Unfortunately, when those young ones go to the towns and cities, their life turns to despair, to sorrow, to hopelessness. Living in shanty towns, disease-ridden, pestilence-ridden. And many of the elders will not welcome them back to the clans, the tribes, the family, because they feel that they're tainted. They've been defiled. They don't want them back. That's why the detachment of that elder. That's the anger in that soft whisper. These people, the world will not see. I hear it time after time from the elders. You know, it used to be, you read any of the chronicles, the journals, the diaries of the early explorers, not only of the United States, but of South America, of Africa, of Australia. Practically all of them refer to by saying, you can tell you're approaching a village from miles away because of the laughter, the songs, the dancing, the happiness. So what do we do? In our arrogance, oh, these people are primitive. They don't have a toilet. They live in shacks built of earth and clay and sticks. Let's give them modern agriculture. Let's teach them to work the fields. Let's have them put in wells for irrigation. Let's give them pesticides. So we come in ignoring their laughter, their happiness, their sense of family and belonging, and how they so easily live with the land in perfect balance and harmony. And we heap upon them our values, where we look at primitive as being somehow akin to being retarded. And the families are forced to work the fields and have larger families so that they can work these larger fields. And then nature does what she always does in that part of the world. Every decade or so, she throws a drought. Now, if those people had been left alone, they would have weathered the drought. They wouldn't have starved. But because they exceeded the carrying capacity of the land, like the deer overpopulating winter landscapes starve, so too did the people. the diseases hit hard and kill because of people being malnourished. We killed them. And our distorted value system, overlooking their laughter and happiness, overlooking their joy, their families, their perfect balance in nature. We wanted them to be just like us, so that someday we can die just like them. So you ask yourself, when did that first prophecy take place? That first probable future? When did it begin? Was it during the starvation? No. It was just after the Second World War, when that first shovel broke ground in Africa. That started the starvation. So no wonder why that elder was bitter. No wonder why he called them these people. Grandfather told me that he felt that the elder, like so many elders have tried to do in the past, have tried to keep those people from modern farming, from the lies of modern society. But they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen. Just like the young people leave the villages and go to the cities. They don't listen. That's why he was bitter. Grandfather said it was almost as if he was hanging out, waiting for each spirit that passed away through that horrible death and starvation to stand there as they made the transition to the world of spirit and say, "See, I told you so. You wouldn't listen to me." And vengeance, that was in the shaman's soul. He was stepping into darkness. He said, the world will not blame itself, but blame nature. Vengeance. Grandfather lay back on the ground, thinking about what he'd witnessed. He knew that it had been a vision of the probable future, and that the spirit of the warrior had brought him to it to teach him what could happen. Grandfather knew that people all over the world were now starving. But why was this starvation so critical? So much more important than all the rest, even more important than the starvation that was taking place now. It was then that Grandfather recalled that the tribal elder had said that the entire world would take notice, but the world would not learn the lessons of what the death and famine were trying to teach. The children would die in vain. That was the big one. With all the concerts, outpouring of money, food, supplies. That was the rise of the warlords, those that hoarded the food and sold it and rationed it. That was the source of genocide, of the problems that still exist in that part of the world today. Okay. Grandfather looked out across the barren land that surrounded the eternal cave to try to reestablish the reality of his now. He said it was still hard to discern between waking reality and the world of vision, but he felt that he was back into his time and place. He told me that the eternal cave was always a place to find visions of the possible and probable futures, And it was not uncommon for the searcher to have vision at the mouth of the cave and not just inside. In a state of physical and emotional exhaustion, grandfather fell into a deep sleep. But it was in this sleep that the warrior spirit appeared to him again and brought the remainder of the first sign to completion. Now, interesting, when grandfather said that he had just finished his third vision quest, he had actually been inside that cave. And why he had come out to sit on that lip at that entrance was to await the sun so that he was going to climb down from the eternal cave. There's a metaphor in that. You know, in the years that followed, and I wish I could expound on it now, very similar to the reason grandfather walked us up that particular path to bring us to that old and forgotten grave. What happened to grandfather in that cave on that third vision quest prepared him for those 4 visions, those 4 warnings of man's destruction. You see, he's still trying to discern at this point whether he's in fact in that visionary state or back into his reality. And he assumed that he was back into his reality because he could see the landscape stretching before him outside of that eternal cave, beyond the lip of that cliff that he sat upon. It's in his dream that the warrior spirit spoke to him again. In his dream, the spirit spoke to grandfather, saying, "It is during the years of the famine, the first sign, that man will be plagued by a disease that will sweep the land and terrorize the masses. The doctors, the white coats, will have no answers for the people, and a great cry will arise across the land. The disease will be born of monkeys, drugs, and sex. It will destroy man from the inside, making common sickness a killing disease. Mankind will bring this disease upon him as a result of his life, his worship of sex and drugs, and a life away from nature. This, too, is part of the first warning. But again, man will not heed this warning, and he will continue to worship the false gods of sex and the unconscious spirit of drugs." Now, that begs the question, back when grandfather was having this vision, there was polio. There was a multitude of other diseases that were taking place, not only in the United States, but throughout Europe, throughout the world. What marked this as different? Well, it was born of monkeys. And the sex and drug factor which perpetuated that disease. In these other illnesses, even the early forms of the avian flu that wiped out millions of people worldwide, that had nothing to do with monkeys, sex, or drugs. What we're talking about here is the AIDS epidemic. But there's a lot that is housed in that. This starts the domino effect. Here, this fast mutating virus has come from the monkey population, But look at all the others that have subsequently followed, which I will come back to later in the second and third prophecy. The Ebola, the SARS, the bird flu. When you look at something like SARS, its ground zero is bats. You see this domino effect. No prophecy stands on its own. It's got tendrils reaching out to many different things. In that whole SARS scenario, people in that part of the world were beginning to starve. And what they were doing is they were going into the jungles and collecting, hunting bats and butchering them on the same tables that they butcher chickens. Thus, that SARS made the leap from the bat population to the human population because we broke the laws of creation. Forced by starvation. Forced by politics. Forced by the destruction of the earth. The Spirit continued saying, the drugs will produce wars in the cities of man, and the nations will arise against those wars, arise against the killing disease. But the nations will fight in the wrong way, lashing out at the effect rather than the cause. Basically, what is going on here is that Spirit is telling grandfather that we have lost our morality as a society. And along with that, in the rush and din and chaos of society, in that living a life just to work, that sense of hopelessness, that sense of quiet desperation, people are turning to drugs to go unconscious, to seek escape. It will never win these wars until the nation, until society changes its values and stops chasing the gods of sex and drugs. It is then, in the years of the first sign, that man can change the course of the probable future. It is then that he may understand the greater lessons of the famine and the disease. It is then that there can still be hope. But once the second sign of destruction appears, the earth can no longer be healed on a physical level. Only a spiritual healing can then change the course of the probable futures of mankind. With that, the warrior spirit let grandfather fall into a deep and dreamless sleep, allowing him to rest fully before any more vision was wrought upon him. You know, in experimentation, if you take rats and put them into overcrowded conditions, eventually diseases will kill off the rats. But in that process, they'll begin to fight and eat each other in the process. Their behavior gets so bizarre because of the conditions in which they live in. Our society virtually has lost hope. I wonder how many people living out there, working the 8 to 5, love what they do in life so much that they would die for their job. I think only a handful. So the rest are just going through their motions. And to drown their sorrow, their boredom, their desperation, They turn to anything they can to numb themselves, whether it is drugs or sex or whatever else. And basically, the Spirit told grandfather, we have lost our morality. We have lost our sense of family. We have lost our sense of community. Look at us. How many of us live in the same neighborhood that we once grew up in? How many of us can go back to that neighborhood and find it just the way we left it? Like they say, there's no going back. You know, I'd like to say that the first sign has come and gone. But it's never truly gone. It's never truly over. There is one warning that bleeds into the next and carries over. The domino effect of disease. The starvation still continues. We didn't learn our lesson from it. The warlords still continue. The genocide still continues. The disease of hopelessness is still out there, of apathy, of helplessness, of desperation is still there. It has still got its tendrils reaching into every subsequent prophecy, every probable future, growing stronger and stronger and stronger as the days pass, heck, as the moments pass. Only the emergence of the second sign brings to a close the first. But what I'm saying is it doesn't really close. It continues. It continues. But once that second sign hit, the earth can no longer heal itself physically. It's a spiritual healing that has to take place. People have got to change their ways of thinking, of acting, of existing. We have worshipped far too long the false gods of the flesh. Far too long. Because that is only going to lead to starvation. What we saw in Africa will come here. No country, no land will be isolated and forgotten. They'll all succumb to the disease and starvation. Done.